So Tom Parker Bowles sits at the center of a story that allegedly had Prince William demanding police action, and the whole thing rests on a document that is quite literally missing its second page. That's where this begins. Not with a rumor, not with the breathless headlines, but with the plain fact that the one piece of paper capable of settling everything is incomplete, and the missing half appears to have walked out of Windsor Castle 2 days before anyone started asking questions. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is an unresolved file sitting in a royal archive, and the fact that no one has offered any explanation for where the rest of it went is by itself the strangest part of this entire story. Before we go any further, if you enjoy watching us dig into royal stories the way they actually unfolded rather than the way tabloid editors prefer to present them, subscribe to Crown Watch. We cover this world every week, and what's coming in the next few videos is not something you want to miss. The Whispers moved before sunrise, traveling through palace corridors faster than any press release ever could. By the time morning staff arrived for their shifts, the conversation had already collapsed into a single sentence that was said to have come from Prince William himself. Have him arrested. No official statement backed those words. No palace spokesperson repeated them on the record. No transcript was released to the public. But the rumor spread anyway, the way rumors do when they carry enough weight to make people repeat them in quiet voices. And within hours, the name at the center of the allegation had caught almost everyone off guard. It was not a senior working royal. It was not a government official or a palace administrator. The speculation landed squarely on Tom Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla's son, a man who had built a well-regarded career as a food writer and television broadcaster entirely apart from royal duties. The claim was that King Charles's private estate had been accessed without proper authorization, and suddenly people at every level of the institution were scrambling to understand what had happened. What made the allegation hit so hard was not simply the suggestion that someone close to the royal family had overstepped a boundary. It was what that boundary actually meant. King Charles's private estates are not weekend retreats governed by informal family customs. They are privately managed properties operating under strict administrative procedures with access controlled through established authorization systems rather than casual arrangements. You cannot arrive with commercial vehicles and a group of guests and treat the grounds like a hired venue. There are access logs, security checkpoints, authorization codes, and documented procedures designed to record exactly who enters which property, when they enter, and under whose authority. So when an estate employee reportedly noticed inconsistencies in visitor records connected to a previous private gathering, nothing about it seemed dramatic at first. The paperwork looked routine. Vehicle movements appeared ordinary. Guest arrivals blended into the long record of legitimate visits accumulated over many months. But one small administrative detail refused to fit the rest of the file, and that single discrepancy prompted an internal review that, according to sources familiar with the situation, expanded far beyond what anyone inside the institution had anticipated. Here is where the timeline begins to get complicated. What reportedly started as a straightforward request for clarification grew into a broader examination of authorization records, communication logs, and estate booking procedures. Each document answered one question while raising two more. Rather than bringing the matter to a close, every page seemed to deepen the uncertainty about what had actually taken place on those grounds. Outside the palace gates, the public remained entirely unaware. Television cameras kept filming tourists outside Buckingham Palace. Guards maintained their ceremonial routines with practiced precision. Visitors smiled for photographs, unaware that advisors inside were reportedly grappling with something that could test the personal loyalties of people at the very center of the monarchy. Prince William allegedly received an early briefing summarizing the growing concerns. No official record of that briefing has ever been released, and much of what followed remains the subject of informed speculation rather than confirmed public fact. But several royal commentators later reported that William's response was immediate and firm. If established procedures protecting the king's private property had been bypassed, he reportedly believed the matter required a full investigation, regardless of who might be implicated. For William, institutional accountability has always sat above personal convenience. Throughout his public life, he has consistently emphasized the importance of protecting the monarchy's integrity, and those who know him well say that reputation explains why even a sensitive internal irregularity would not be quietly shelved. Meanwhile, attention was slowly turning toward Tom Parker Bowles. He had spent years establishing himself as a credible voice in food media, operating at a comfortable distance from the formal obligations of royal life. But his relationship to Queen Camilla meant that every public appearance carried a different kind of weight. Routine invitations attracted unusual scrutiny. Ordinary social events became fodder for speculation. In that kind of atmosphere, separating what was real from what was rumored became almost impossible for anyone watching from the outside. As the weeks passed, competing versions of the story began circulating through media circles in London. One account described the controversy as a simple misunderstanding over estate access protocols. Another suggested that internal disagreements had been building for months, but were kept quiet to avoid public embarrassment. A third, far more dramatic version alleged that internal documents painted a considerably darker picture. None of these competing accounts had been officially confirmed, yet each gained traction as the silence from palace officials continued. Behind that silence lay a question that few outside the institution could answer. Why had no one spoken publicly to settle the matter? Experienced royal correspondents noted that the palace routinely declines to comment on internal administrative disputes, particularly when private royal properties are involved. That policy, intended to protect confidentiality, frequently allows speculation to fill the space that facts should occupy. And that is exactly what happened here. Inside one secure office, according to accounts that have never been independently verified, several thick folders were arranged across a polished conference table. Estate correspondence, access records, internal memoranda, approval procedures. Each file represented another piece of a picture that resisted easy reading. Advisors reportedly worked through every page with unusual care, aware that a single overlooked detail could redirect the entire inquiry. Then the review encountered something that changed its direction entirely. The heavy doors of the State Administration Office at Sandringham closed, and a thick folder landed on the center of the table. Pages spread across the dark wood, revealing rows of printed access logs, handwritten gate sign-in sheets, and time-stamped security transcripts. The senior estate administrator told the room to examine the entry dates and then compare them against the official clearance registry for the same weekend. The gap between the two was impossible to explain away. On 3 separate occasions over the previous 6 months, commercial vehicles and private guests had entered restricted sections of the king's private grounds. They had cleared security checkpoints during hours when the estate was formally listed as closed to all non-essential personnel. The signatures authorizing that access did not belong to the estate warden. They did not belong to the head of security. The authorization code attached to the electronic barrier logs matched a private administrative profile that had no business overriding royal security protocols. Legal advisors exchanged uneasy glances across the table. Nobody said the name out loud, but it was present in the room nonetheless. The administrative profile in question had been created during a routine departmental update and was listed under an internal reference code tied directly to communications handled by Tom Parker Bowles' private liaison office. What had started as a quiet administrative check was no longer an isolated question. The review widened. reaching into every corner of the royal property management system. Within hours, teams of auditors were quietly deployed across multiple locations: Sandringham, Balmoral, and the administrative wings of Windsor Castle. Filing cabinets were opened, server archives were pulled for inspection. Correspondence files covering nearly 2 years were laid out across long tables. Access logs were cross-referenced with fuel receipts, catering delivery records, and private maintenance requests. The deeper the auditors looked, the more complicated the picture became. Different factions within the palace structure began pulling in opposite directions. On one side were the senior estate administrators, many of whom had served the crown through decades of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. To them, the records represented a serious failure of protocol. The rules governing the monarch's private land were not suggestions. They were written into law and constitutional precedent. If private individuals, regardless of their proximity to the royal family through marriage, had been accessing royal assets or granting entry to third parties without authorization, the integrity of the crown's private governance was compromised. On the other side stood advisors aligned with the modernizing priorities of the current reign. They argued, with some force, that the matter was being blown well out of proportion. The access logs, they insisted, were the result of administrative overlap during the turbulent transition of authority following the king's accession. Informal arrangements had been misread by staff members who were looking for problems that did not exist. The argument grew heated enough during one afternoon briefing that an advisor gathered his papers, stood, and left the room, leaving the legal team to continue without him. Prince William, receiving daily briefings on the situation, reportedly refused to accept reassurances that lacked substance. Those who work closely with the Prince of Wales describe a man who holds firm on questions of institutional compliance. He understood that public expectations had shifted. A modern audience demanded transparency, and any suggestion that royal estates were being treated as private perks for non-working family members could do lasting damage to the monarchy's standing. He reportedly made his position clear: no quiet reclassification of security violations as clerical errors, no shelving of inconvenient findings to protect anyone's reputation. Every log entry had to be accounted for. Every signature had to be verified. If unauthorized access had taken place, the full truth had to be documented. Yet the harder the legal team pushed, the more the evidence resisted simple conclusions. For every document suggesting an improper bypass of authority, another record emerged that appeared to contradict it. An email chain showed an estate manager discussing venue logistics weeks before one of the flagged dates, which implied that someone somewhere had known the visits were coming. But the formal approval form, the legal document required under estate bylaws, was absent from the physical archive. Had it been misfiled by careless staff, or had it been deliberately removed? The psychological strain inside the palace was becoming visible. Colleagues who had worked alongside each other for years began watching one another with quiet reserve. Conversations in the corridors stopped the moment someone unfamiliar walked past. The silence inside the building was no longer comfortable. It was a held breath waiting for something to crack. Then came the discovery that redirected everything. An analyst working through an archived database of internal memos uncovered a misfiled document from 18 months earlier. It was a confidential administrative directive, signed not by an estate manager, but originating from the desk of a senior private secretary. The memorandum described a secondary framework for estate permissions, one that directly conflicted with the official legal guidelines governing the monarch's private property. The auditors looked at the screen for a long moment before anyone spoke. This document did not resolve the mystery. It tore it open. It suggested that the conflicting authorizations were not the result of a single rogue decision or an honest misunderstanding by Tom Parker Bowles' office. Instead, it pointed toward an embedded, undisclosed rift in how authority had been defined within the royal households following the transfer of the crown. The legal team was summoned back immediately. The discovery meant the investigation could no longer be treated as a localized estate matter. It had become a systemic question of governance, touching the very boundaries of royal authority, private privilege, and legal accountability. Someone at a senior level within the palace hierarchy had authorized an entirely parallel system of control, and the confidential memorandum now forced investigators toward a larger and considerably more dangerous question. Who had given the order to create it? The private meeting that followed was convened under strict secrecy. No standard secretarial minutes were kept. Only the most trusted advisors were permitted in the room. Prince William stood near the tall window overlooking the private gardens, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid. Across the table, two senior legal advisors sat still, their eyes resting on an open red leather binder between them. When William spoke, his voice was very quiet, and he wanted to know how a parallel directive had existed without his knowledge. The senior legal counsel, adjusting his glasses slowly, explained that the document appeared to have been drafted during the administrative transition period and filed within a private internal registry that did not routinely report to the main estate governance council. That explanation did not make the situation easier. On the table lay three documents placed side by side. The first was the original Estate Governance Act, which clearly stated that all non-monarchic use of private royal land required direct written approval from the sovereign's official estate stewards. The second was the security log showing multiple entries by individuals connected to Tom Parker Bowles' private associates. The third was the newly uncovered internal memorandum, which explicitly claimed to grant administrative override permissions under a broad and vaguely worded clause relating to family hospitality. The conflict between those three papers was complete. If the secondary directive was legally valid, the visits were technically authorized and no wrongdoing had occurred. If it was not, every entry made under its provisions constituted unauthorized access to royal property. The advisors were caught between two equally damaging outcomes. To validate the secondary memo meant acknowledging that private royal estates had been managed through informal channels that bypassed official oversight. To invalidate it meant subjecting non-working family members to potential legal scrutiny and public exposure. Beyond the oak doors, the media was assembling. Broadcast trucks had parked along the mall. Telephoto lenses tracked every arrival and departure of legal staff from private entrances. Speculation was spreading across digital platforms and international news networks. Journalists were referencing a senior-level conflict between royal households and openly questioning whether the management of King Charles's private wealth was undergoing an emergency review. Inside the meeting, competing accounts of private conversations made the picture more complicated. One senior official claimed King Charles had given verbal approval for informal access arrangements months earlier, wanting to spare family members the delay of bureaucratic procedures. Another advisor flatly denied this, insisting the king had never sanctioned any departure from statutory protocol and had not been aware the secondary directive existed. The contradiction exposed something deeper. The institution was navigating its own identity, caught between an older tradition of informal royal privilege and a modern requirement for legal transparency. For William, this was not a question of paperwork. It went to the foundation of his future reign. If rules could bend for family members today, the legitimacy of the entire institution would be eroded. He reportedly demanded a full accounting of every individual who had seen, approved, or acted on the hidden memorandum. The harder the legal team pressed, the more elusive the answers became. Staff members gave careful, guarded responses designed to protect their own positions. Written correspondence from the relevant period was sparse. made up of email chains that referenced phone calls and offline conversations that left no paper trail. Whoever had created the secondary framework appeared to have built it to resist scrutiny. By late evening, the room was filled with exhaustion. Legal advisors sat surrounded by estate charters, constitutional references, and privacy law summaries. The question was no longer simply about who had walked onto royal property. It had become a contest for authority within the royal household itself. As the meeting prepared to close without resolution, a low knock came at the door. A junior clerk entered carrying a small, ribbon-tied leather dossier that had just been retrieved from the deepest storage vaults beneath Windsor Castle. The clerk placed it on the table directly in front of Prince William. The advisors leaned forward. One final document rested inside that sealed folder, a piece of original correspondence that had remained buried for over a decade, and it carried the potential to determine whether this entire controversy was an administrative failure, an ethical lapse, or something of an entirely different character. King Charles rose from his desk and turned away from the assembled advisors, facing the darkening courtyard through the window. The silence in the private study was absolute. The unsealed dossier lay open on the desk behind him, its pages revealing an administrative precedent that no one in the room had been prepared for. The internal review had reached its end. There were no more archives to unlock, no more server logs to retrieve, no more legal opinions outstanding. The full scope of the audit was now spread across the table, binding the monarch, his heir, and their legal counsel in a situation that none of them had anticipated. The king's voice, when he spoke, was quiet and heavy with fatigue. He said that past assumptions could not be undone. The only question before them was how the crown moved forward from this point. The final findings of the internal inquiry did not support the criminal allegations circulating across social media and in the tabloid press. There was no conspiracy, no misappropriated fortune, no illegal operation running inside the gates of Sandringham or Windsor. Yet, the reality the investigation uncovered was, in its own way, more damaging to the internal foundation of the monarchy than a straightforward scandal might have been. The review established that for over a decade, estate governance had been fractured by competing lines of administrative authority. Informal verbal permissions given in private rooms had routinely been treated as equivalent to formal written protocols. The private administrative office connected to Tom Parker Bowles had operated in genuine belief that its access was fully authorized by long-standing internal practice. At the same time, estate wardens and legal custodians had been operating on the belief that those same actions represented an unprecedented breach of constitutional governance. Two parallel systems of authority had coexisted for years without ever formally acknowledging each other, until a misplaced log entry forced them into a collision. Outside the palace, public reaction had reached full intensity. Front pages speculated daily on imminent arrests, secret police inquiries, and family feuds, threatening to fracture the institution. Commentators demanded statements urging the palace to clarify whether royal land had been improperly used. Inside the corridors, the emotional toll was visible in a different way. The personal strain between King Charles and Prince William was apparent to anyone entering the private quarters during that period. William pressed for sweeping administrative reforms that would remove informal privileges from all non-working family members and place estate access under standardized, publicly governed guidelines. King Charles, positioned between his duties as sovereign and his loyalty as a husband and father, faced a choice with no clean option. To implement William's reforms immediately would be read publicly as an admission of guilt, permanently damaging Queen Camilla's son and casting a shadow over the family. To resist those reforms risked a lasting rupture with his son and heir, while leaving the institution open to the same kind of governance failure in the future. Every reported exchange between the king and the Prince of Wales was described as tense, brief, and weighted by a silence neither man knew how to close. The atmosphere inside the palace had shifted. Staff described an environment where every document was verified twice, every phone call treated with caution, and the warmth that had once existed between longtime colleagues had given way to something more formal and far less trusting. The legal team presented its final recommendations. They advised against any public statement concerning criminal conduct, since no evidence of criminality had been established. Instead, they proposed a complete overhaul of private estate management, dissolving the secondary administrative framework and revoking all informal access arrangements across every royal property. It was a structural victory for the kind of modernized, transparent monarchy William had long argued for. But it arrived at a cost that no reform document could quantify. As the meeting closed and advisors began packing their cases, the tension in the study slowly gave way to a quieter, colder kind of resignation. The internal review had concluded. The structural weaknesses had been identified and the reforms were being drafted. Then the senior legal counsel, closing the final dossier and sliding it toward his briefcase, paused. His eyes stopped on a single handwritten note attached to the inside back cover. The investigation was finished. The institutional answers had been written down. But one question remained in the room, unresolved, waiting to complicate everything they believed they had just settled. A single yellowed slip of paper slid out from the back of the archive file and came to rest beside the king's slippered feet. The legal counsel's hand stopped in midair above his open briefcase. Prince William stepped forward and picked it up from the floor. It was a private handwritten memorandum, dated years before the estate controversy had ever surfaced. As his eyes moved across the faded ink, the entire foundation of the scandal shifted beneath them. The document was not an approval form. It was not a clearance record. It was a direct, confidential directive written in the hand of a senior sovereign official, explicitly stating that authority over private estate access was intended to remain permanently ambiguous, specifically to protect certain delicate internal arrangements. In that moment, the entire narrative changed shape. The fierce allegations, the rumors of criminal conduct, the claims that Tom Parker Bowles or members of the non-working royal circle had deliberately seized unauthorized control over royal property. All of it had been grounded in a vast and long-standing misunderstanding. The controversy had not been born from criminal intent. It was the predictable result of conflicting interpretations of a system that had been designed by someone to remain deliberately unclear. The central mystery had an answer, but that answer offered no comfort. It revealed a monarchy whose most serious vulnerability was not external pressure or hostile media, but its own accumulated history of quiet compromise and deliberately blurred lines of authority. And here is the detail that changes the weight of everything else. The handwritten directive recovered from that dossier carried an official tracking stamp confirming it was only the first page of a two-part confidential order. The second page, which contained the specific names of individuals granted unrestricted access across all crown properties, was not in the royal archives. Someone had removed that second page from Windsor Castle 48 hours before the audit began. Who removed it, and what names appeared on it, remains entirely unknown. The public debate over accountability, governance, and the protection of the monarch's private interests will continue to move through newsrooms and across dinner tables for some time to come. Trust within the royal household has fractured. Administrative lines have been redrawn, and the emotional distance between a father and his son remains a quiet wound behind palace doors. The kind that institutions can work around, but families rarely forget. The real question was never whether Tom Parker Bowles crossed a line. The real question is who knew that line was designed to be ambiguous, who benefited from keeping it that way across all those years, and who walked out of Windsor Castle carrying the one document that could finally tell the whole truth.